I believed marriage was about patience. I didn't know patience could become a prison.
The town did not question his marriages. They questioned the women. Because in that town, when something breaks many times, people assume the hand holding it must be innocent. His name was Richard Cole. And Richard Cole was wealthy. Not loud wealth. Not careless wealth. Quiet wealth. The kind that did not announce itself, but made people lower their voices around it. Richard lived where roads widened, where houses breathed, where fences were tall, and neighbors minded their business. Because money was nearby, he was respected. Not because he was generous, but because he was stable. And in uncertain places, stability looks like wisdom. Richard had married before. Once. Then again. Then again. Each marriage followed the same pattern. A beautiful beginning. A quiet ending. No police. No scandals. No shouting. Just separation. People whispered. They said, women only want his money. They come, they enjoy, they leave. Richard is too kind. Richard never argued. He never defended himself aggressively. He simply nodded. And nodding convinced people. He had nothing to hide. No one asked the ex-wife's questions. They were already gone. One returned to her parents. Another relocated to another city. Another disappeared completely. When their names came up, Richard sighed. He said he tried. He said he endured. He said marriage was difficult. People agreed. Marriage is difficult. So they stopped asking. But stories do not disappear. They only wait. Then came Grace Miller. She did not grow up dreaming of wealth. She dreamed of peace. She worked. She paid her bills. She lived carefully. She was not invisible. But she was not admired. People described her as simple, which in that town meant unremarkable. When news spread that Richard Cole wanted to marry again, people reacted differently. Some felt excitement. Some felt concern. Some said nothing. Grace heard the rumors. She heard the warnings. She heard the jokes. She listened. But she also observed Richard herself. He was polite, soft-spoken, attentive. He spoke about values, about order, about respect. He did not shout. He did not boast. And that convinced Grace that people misunderstood him. Before agreeing to marriage, Grace asked carefully. She asked why his previous marriages ended. Richard answered calmly. He said the women changed. He said money revealed their true nature. He said they stopped respecting him. Grace listened. She did not challenge him. She believed patience mattered. And so she agreed. The wedding was not extravagant. But it was expensive. Everything worked. Everything flowed. Everything looked correct. People congratulated Richard. They congratulated Grace. They said she was lucky. Grace smiled. Luck is a dangerous word when used too early. The first months were peaceful. Grace cooked. Grace cleaned. Grace adjusted. Richard provided. Richard planned. Richard directed. He corrected small things. How she spoke. How she dressed. How she served guests. Grace accepted it as learning. She wanted to be a good wife. But correction slowly became control. Richard disliked questions. Not loud questions. Gentle ones. When Grace asked why, he said she was challenging him. When she expressed discomfort, he said she was ungrateful. He reminded her often. He paid the bills. He owned the house. He made the decisions. Grace began to feel small. Not abused loudly, but reduced quietly. Richard corrected Grace in front of visitors. Not harshly. Politely. Enough to make her doubt herself. When she stayed silent, he accused her of pride. When she explained, he accused her of disrespect. There was no safe response. Grace began to observe patterns. The same arguments. The same accusations. The same exhaustion. And then she remembered. These were the same stories. People whispered about the other women. Grace did not cry. She did not complain to neighbors. She did not threaten divorce. She decided to study the marriage. She watched how Richard spoke. How he withdrew affection. How he used silence. She learned the system. And one day, she stopped resisting it. Grace changed quietly. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped pleading. She stopped reacting emotionally. When Richard spoke coldly, she responded calmly. When he ignored her, she gave him space. When he tried to provoke her, she remained neutral. Richard noticed. At first, he felt powerful. Then, uneasy. Because power requires reaction. Richard complained. He said Grace had changed. Grace responded gently. She said nothing had changed. She said she was only adjusting. Richard did not understand. Because men who control others panic when control stops working. Richard began to feel lonely. Ignored. Unimportant. The house was quiet. Not peaceful. Empty. When he raised his voice, Grace lowered hers. When he accused her of pride, she asked calmly what pride meant. He became frustrated. Because his tools no longer worked. One evening, Richard asked Grace what she wanted. Grace answered carefully. She said she wanted balance. She explained she had learned his language. She said she was treating him the way he treated her. Silence followed. For the first time, Richard saw himself. Not as a provider. Not as a victim. But as the common factor. He remembered the other women. Their silence. Their exhaustion. Their departure. And he understood. They were not weak. They were surviving. Richard apologized. He promised change. He softened. Grace listened. Then she explained something gently. She said adaptation becomes habit. She said habit does not disappear overnight. She said she did not want divorce. But she would no longer accept imbalance. Richard felt fear. Not of losing her, but of losing dominance. This marriage did not collapse. It transformed. Richard stopped remarrying. Stopped speaking badly of women. Stopped blaming. People noticed. Whispers changed direction. Years later, people realized something. If every woman leaves the same man, the problem is not desire. It is behavior. Grace stayed. Not to suffer, but to reflect. She forced Richard to confront himself. Because sometimes, the strongest response to cruelty is not escape, but exposure. The town learned slowly. Some men are not unlucky in love. They are consistent in damage. And some women do not leave immediately. They stay long enough to reveal the truth. If only she knew how he treated his ex-wives, she would have understood sooner. But staying taught her something deeper. That patience without wisdom is suffering. And love without respect is bondage. And sometimes, the greatest punishment is not being left, but being seen.